All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Millennial Sales Podcast. This is Tom Alemo, your host. They call me Tommy Tahoe around here. Really excited to be having another episode and with you in your ears as you're going to the grocery store, you're working out, walking the dog, whatever it is that you're doing right now. I'm excited to be here and thanks for joining. So this is episode 195. We're closing in on 200. We're kicking off the year 2021 strong. I've got a great interview for you today that I think you're going to love. It's with Bryan Smith. So let's take a step back. Mental health and burnout. Um, Although they've gotten more play in the last few years, I think are still highly um, dismissed in business, especially in sales. And I think they're so prevalent. I could not tell you how many salespeople and sales leaders I've met that have told me, and whether they want to admit this to their boss or to, in public, that have told me personally that they struggle with something around mental health. Gotten burnt out before. They feel anxious. It affects their moods. It affects their sleep. They have stress dreams about work. If you can relate to any of that, give me a snap because I definitely can. And Bryan Smith comes in with a really interesting background, an ex wellness professional. He was a pro sports performance coach, right? That turned founder and startup advisor. So essentially, he was working as a sports science consultant with Olympic athletes. So he worked with athletes that represented over 7 countries in the 2016 Olympic Games in Rio. Um, and he explains this in the interview, and he'll do a much better job than I will. But he really worked with athletes to understand and customize, their regimens to fit their needs, their individual needs, right? So if you got to understand what your threshold looks like in terms of exertion, and then trying to match peak performance without overdoing it, right? Because if you overdo it in an athletic sense, you're more likely to get hurt, right? Or you're not going to perform at your highest level. And if you're at the elite percentage where you're in the Olympics, every second, every inch, every pound, whatever it might be, counts. So that's what Bryan was doing formerly. He then took that to co-found Leon, which is the first ever AI-driven employee performance platform, which is a mouthful. But essentially, what he's doing is taking that science behind mental health and burnout and exertion that we face mentally in business or in sales specifically, um, and helping companies to help take care of their employees, right? So in the instance where you're going hard as a sales rep, right? In say Q4, right? We were all doing that. We were all trying to close our deals before the end of the year. If your year ends in January, you're still doing that, and God bless, right? And if you're in that mode, at least for me, at the end of every single year around Christmas time, I get a cold without fail because the day that I stop working and grinding, my body, a day or two later realizes, oh shit, we've been on reserves for a while. We haven't been sleeping enough. We haven't been eating maybe right. We've been drinking maybe too much. We've been sleeping not enough. We haven't exercised enough, etc. And so my body like forces itself into a shutdown. And maybe that's familiar to you, maybe not. But this is what Bryan's really focused on, is the physiological aspect of burnout, which is super interesting, of trying to give some great strategies on how you as a salesperson or as a leader can help to follow that wave, understand your threshold, understand where you're at, and try to kind of guide how hard you should be working, what types of activities should you do on certain days, things like that. It's super interesting. I really think you're going to like this conversation. Bryan's super down to earth, and a really smart guy. So I think you're going to love this. If you do love it, first hit him up, Bryan with a Y, Smith on LinkedIn. You can check out Leon, that's Leon on LinkedIn, or check their website. You can add me. I love talking to people that listen to the podcast on Twitter or Instagram. I'm Tommy Tahoe. On LinkedIn, I'm Tom Alemo. You're listening to this probably on Apple or Spotify, or maybe you're looking at me on YouTube. If so, this is a new shirt. I hope you like it. And the one thing that you can do to help for this show is to go to Apple Podcasts, subscribe, and leave a quick 5-star review. It should take you less than a minute. You type in Millennial Sales, you hit subscribe and leave a review. Helps me grow the show. It helps me get better guests. Helps me provide a better product to you on the back end, right? So we've always got 200 episodes. We're tight like that. I hope you can do me a favor and leave that review, or otherwise just share this thing out on social, or tag me or send it to a friend or your team on Slack, whatever it might be. Hopefully this episode helps. Hopefully this episode in particular, if you know someone that's struggling with mental health, this might help them to see some of the physiological aspects of it and learn a new thing. So I hope you enjoy this episode. I really do think you will. Let me know what you think. Without further ado, let's get straight into my conversation with Bryan Smith. Let's go. All right, we're live. Bryan Smith, what's up, man?
What's going on, Tom? How's Connecticut?
Oh, it's good. We had a little storm here yesterday, but it's all cleared now in the wilderness here, surrounded by oak trees. How are you doing?
It's good. I had the same storm. We had like thunderstorm warnings all day. And my daughter, she's in like competition gymnastics, right? So on Monday night she has like a 3-hour practice. So which I have to sit there for, and I love my daughter, right? But I was sort of hoping for tornadoes at some point, so I wouldn't have to go sit in a gymnastics place for 3 hours. But other than that, everything's good.
Is it just one kid that you have?
I have two daughters. Yeah, so I have an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old. So my 8-year-old is like super gymnast, right? Can bang out like 20 pull-ups in a clip. It's pretty impressive. I know it's ridiculous. Like I couldn't even climb a rope when I was that age, right? And she's like just pull up like, and she'll do it for money too. She's like, Dad, how much are you giving me today? If I do a pull up, so I'm like $30 in. I'm like, all right, that's enough. Let's stop there.
Now, did you encourage a lot of that, athletics as a kid, just based on your background, or not really?
No, not really. It's so funny, especially within sports and really with sales to a certain extent. There's the sort of nature versus nurture sort of conversation and argument, right? My 11-year-old is a complete bookworm, right? Super intelligent, super smart, into Harry Potter, like you sort of name it, right? Like that sort of fits into that category. Like if there was a Comic-Con, she'd be there right now. Where my 8-year-old is probably one of the most athletic people I've ever seen in my life, completely on her own, right? But it fits into her personality too. Like she'll just do headstands like all over the place, or she'll do splits all over the place. But this was even before gymnastics. So it's just funny, like the way that they came out of like the womb is sort of the way they are, right? I didn't influence her athleticism. I didn't influence her energy. They're just, you knew how they were right from the start, and they sort of came on that track. And as a parent, you just sort of have to influence that a little bit, right? But it's really interesting stuff. And, the sales stuff is the same things, right? And we'll get into this a little bit more about mental health and resiliency and all these other things. But, some of us are born certain ways, and some of us can handle certain things, especially when it comes from stress and just being resilient and adapting to burnout. And a lot of those things are physiological in nature. So yeah, it's pretty cool stuff.
And so were you growing up, were you in the athlete camp? Like, did you play a bunch of sports, I imagine, and probably pretty naturally gifted?
No. I was not gifted at all. I played all the sports, but I never really did anything organized. And, this really comes into, like, I was a really bad kid, man. Through high school and everything, to a point where, like, after high school, like, I probably wasn't getting into college, so I went into the military. So I spent 6 years in the Army, and then I went to university. But, a lot of it was like I really wanted to play organized sports, but I was so stubborn, I guess, and like refused to like be coached or listen to people. That just being in that environment and being yelled at by a coach just wasn't going to happen, as far as what was going on right now. But it also, I think, being that way sort of led me into starting multiple companies and sort of being on the role today. So I guess I wouldn't change anything.
Yeah. So you went to the Army, and then you went to university, and then after that, I see that it looked like you were like a GM for an LA Fitness for 6, 7, 8 years, and then there's like a sharp transition from owning an LA Fitness for almost a decade to getting into some of the sports psychology type of stuff with track and field. What was the pivot point there? How did that happen?
Yeah, so I was in the Army Reserve. So during that time, I was going to university and was going to school, and I went to school for exercise science. And then, after that, I got into a situation where I knew I had to be sort of in fitness, but also, or in sports science or whatever. But getting into that space is really, really hard, right? Because what you have to do is essentially you have to start as like an unpaid intern, at some like D3 college or something along those lines and work your way up. And quite honestly, I was just sort of unwilling to do that because I wanted to make money, right? And it's funny, as an LA Fitness general manager, and I worked up to like eventually a senior vice president. I was like 21, 22, probably making three, $400,000 a year.
Whew.
I know, so it was crazy, right? So I was like, I saw that, I was like, dude, I'm not doing anything else. Like, this is ridiculous. I can't make this
Yeah.
anywhere, especially working at a gym. But it was like hardcore sales, bro. Like, 20 to 30 new memberships a day, constant cold calling, working on Christmas, like working every single holiday, just like, it was the stereotypical like ABC sort of always be closing. Like to a point, we'd have closeouts twice a month, right? We'd have a closeout on the 15th of the month and then the month. And all the general managers and VPs would get together and go to someone's house, and when you're 21, they had this big ass house, right? And this dude's like 25 and he's driving like a Benz and he's got like a $1 million house. And we'd all sit around and watch Boiler Room and we'd all get like amped up, like jacked up on Boiler Room, and it was so stereotypical. It was just ridiculous. But during that time, I was like sort of moonlighting as an intern with some professional sports organizations, and coaching clinics and whatnot. And eventually that turned into me working with a professional track and field group. Um, and I had great success. I worked with Chanel Price, who won the world championships in 800 meter in like 2012, or I think. Then eventually worked with a guy named Inderjeet Singh, who was he won the European World Championships in shot put. And we had just great success, and I really sort of caught on to it. And eventually that sort of took me into consulting for track and field really across the world. In the Olympics, in the Rio Olympics, I had probably over 30 athletes that I was consulting with
Wow.
on a daily basis. So it's pretty cool. And, and we'll probably get into it, but the consulting stuff is really interesting because, essentially what we're doing is we're taking data like blood testing, muscle biopsies, like literally like digging through someone's muscle, EEG, looking at like heart rate monitoring, ECG, looking at like brainwave activity, as well as like benchmark against previous athletes. And we use that to ultimately predict performance 4 years out, and
Mm.
actually predict a medal 4 years out, or even predict injury to a certain extent.
Mm.
So that's what we did. I wasn't necessarily like lifting the weights with them. It was more like legit sort of like sports science type applications.
Interesting. And so would that then affect what their training regimen was based on, hey, you have this type of, genetics. You need to, lift heavier weights, or you need to lay off the weights and do more, stretching, or I don't know. I'm just kind of making this
Totally.
up. Or you need to change
No,
your
no,
diet based on that type of stuff.
100%, 100%. So, especially when you got into like muscle fiber typing, right? Like you'd understand, for lack of a, I guess, better analogy, like if someone's a Ferrari or if someone's is like a Tesla, right?
Hmm.
And as far as how they work, and Tesla might be a poor example, but use like a Ford, I guess. One is able to go super duper long distance, doesn't get beat up. But if you try pushing a Ferrari, all day, every day is like your daily beater, it's just going to break down, right? And you
Hmm.
have to be able to train those athletes individually and program those athletes individually to a point where even the recovery modalities are very different, right? Like we would be able to know how a recovery modality, like say ice bath or sauna or something like that, or even nutritional interventions or heavy massage or light massage, how that impacted a specific athlete and what their recovery response was. So we'd know, oh shit, this recovery causes a negative stimulus to this athlete. This
Hmm.
type of recovery causes a positive stimulus to this type of athlete, right? Because
Hmm.
we're so individual. And going back to what I said about nature nurture, we're all born a certain way. We all have a physiological makeup. And some of those are sort of impacted by, um, childhood trauma, by epigenetics, genetics, lifestyle as a child, lifestyle as a teen. All those things sort of make up all these things, but ultimately we have one sort of physiological disposition. And I talk about this a lot with resiliency, which you've probably heard a ton going on right now about resiliency in sales and all these other
Hmm.
things, right? It's probably the most bullshit, biggest overused word in the whole entire world, right? And what I mean by that is, what do HR managers say about resiliency? How do you build resiliency? You talk to your managers more, you manage your mental health, have a seminar, all like, how many resiliency webinars have you seen by fucking bullshit HR people? Um, and most of the time, man, resiliency has been already predetermined 20 years ago. All right.
Yeah.
And we all have this bandwidth that we're able to work within, right? And my bandwidth might be a 10, your bandwidth might be a 7. And as soon as you hit a 7, all right, you start decreasing, right? You start like de-adapting. All right. And as soon as I hit a 10, I start going down. But other people might have a 20, other people might have a 30, you know. So when we say managing mental health or managing resiliency or pushing harder, it's not, everybody's so individually different, right? And it's really hard to make assumptions as a manager, especially as a sales manager, on how hard you can push your team and what's right for every individual within your organization.
And so I just want to kind of dive all the way in here because I've seen you post about that and talk about, it's a very individual thing. And I like what you're saying about the different bandwidths, right? Some people might have a 7, some might have a 10, some might have a 20. So my first question would be, how do you know what your own like, how do you get to know yourself to that level? Because in my experience, and this is just me, I'm an ambitious guy. I just push and I push and I push and I push. And then one day I'm just feel fucked up. And,
Mhm.
I feel, depressed, or I feel super sluggish, or, I sleep for 12 hours or whatever it might be. And I've had moments where I crash, pretty hard. And I've had moments where I've, kind of wavered and, I'm like, oh man, I'm not feeling it today. And like kind of different ebbs and flows of that.
Sure.
So I'm curious how you get to know, your own level, and then can you increase that? Are there ways that I can take myself from a 7 to a 10 or to a 20?
Yeah. So let's get into sort of the stress response theory, or it used to be called general adaptation theory. Essentially, what happens is your body is always trying to maintain a level of allostasis, right? Or maybe a better term for people understanding is homeostasis,
Yeah.
right? And then this is sort of like your body in homeostasis. And then what happens is there's a stressor that's given to you. And that stressor could be anything. It could be a fight with your fiance or your wife, your husband, or whatever that is, right? And there's a disruption in homeostasis. And what happens is that there's a decrease in in your homeostatic response, right? And as you're sort of going down, your body's trying to adapt, all right, to that stressor, right? It's by using hormones and all these other things, mostly hormones, to sort of adapt and sort of help your body sort of level out and then come back up and super compensate, right? That term super compensation is super important here because there is homeostasis, stress response, recovery, super compensate. Now, super compensate means that you're giving yourself a higher level of homeostasis, right? So every stress response your body recovers, it learns how to adapt to that stress response. And now it will never adapt the same way. Does that make sense? Because it's learned how
Yeah.
what that stressor was and how it needs to adapt to it. So now the next time you feel that stress, there's a little less slight disruption, right? It doesn't
Hmm.
go as deep down. Now, what happens within all of us, especially when we're trending towards burnout, there is no super compensation, right?
Mm.
Because what happens? All right, homeostasis. All right, you're disrupted, so there's a stressor. All right, say that's day one. All right, another stressor comes in day 2. Another stressor comes in day 3. Another stressor comes in day 4. Another stressor comes in day 5. Then the weekend comes, and then you might super compensate a little bit, but you just fucking went through 7 days of like serious stress, right? And then Monday happens again, more stress, more stress, more stress,
Mm.
more stress, slight compensation, more stress, more stress, more stress. That is burnout. Burnout is not, I just feel shitty about myself. Burnout is a physiological response that when it gets tough enough, presents itself as a mental health issue. And
Mm.
that's important for people to understand. So when you ask us like, how do you understand personally from a you standpoint, what's going on? it's really hard, right? Unless you're using sort of data or whatnot, or sort of like you can use HRV. There's a lot of sort of different testing applications you can understand from a physiological standpoint, but Taleb, have you ever read Taleb, Nassim Taleb, the book Anti-Fragile by any chance?
No, that's on my list though.
Yeah,
I've heard
read
it's
it.
good.
It's a great book.
Okay.
So he talks about this concept of like waiting for inspiration to sort of do work, right?
Hmm.
And one thing I've learned as I got a little bit older is that the days that I feel like shit are the days that I feel like shit. And I can't push as hard that day. And sometimes you have to like I love this concept of ranking, especially from like a SDR or an AE standpoint, ranking activities on a stress level, right? On a 1 to 5,
Mm,
right?
okay.
So if you feel great today, dude, do your stressful activities, make your cold calls, do your meetings, do your pitches, talk to your managers, do whatever, right? Because that's the day that you feel good. All right. And that's your 5s. On the day 2, say, you're not feeling that great, but you're not like 100% in the ground. Maybe that's a day you do your 2 and 3 activities. Maybe that's a day you do your cold emails, your social touches, or whatever, right?
Hmm.
By day 3, maybe that's the day that you do your lead research, or update CRM or whatever. Like, I know this is not sort of like a like, because real life doesn't work this way, right?
Yep.
Sometimes you got to do this all the time, but that's what we want to go for, right? Is you want to try to bucket each things in stressful activities, moderate activities, low activities, right? And then take those into account based off how you feel and do those that day. Because what happens is you don't get the mental strain of feeling like you're not doing anything, right? Because that's tough within itself as well. You're like, shit, I didn't do anything today. I
Mm.
was useless. And you beat yourself up, right? Like, that sucks. So at least what you can do is those days that you feel bad, you can still be productive. You can still move the needle forward, but you're not adding more stress to an already stressed out system, right? You're allowing that recovery process to happen. Now, the greatest thing about this is if you allow this to happen the right way, right? You allow that super compensation process to happen, right? Disruption, super compensation. Over time, you trend up, right? You're constantly, and I'm going to use this term fitness, not from like an exercise standpoint, but from like an evolutionary standpoint, right? Like,
Hmm.
there's you're developing fitness as you go to
Mm.
continually excel at your job, because you're managing literally finite resources, which are like hormones and energy sources and whatnot within your body, all right, to continuously sort of adapt and improve, rather than what happens in everyday life right now, with especially with working in tech. It's a constant sort of like fight or flight response always. And
Yeah.
fight or flight response, constant fight or flight response, dude, it leads to early death. Like, that's legit, but
Yeah.
we don't take that into account.
That's interesting. So, how do you feel about even splitting it up within the day? Like, let's say, what I've tried to do and advise people to do is, like when I feel good, usually I feel better in the morning than I feel later in the afternoon. I'm a morning person. I'm, energetic. So I try to get my harder things done in the morning. Like, that's when I'll do a workout. That's when I'll do my prospecting. That's when I'll, maybe have a podcast interview. Like, if I have a big meeting, I'll try to do it in the morning. And then afternoon is when I might, do my lead lists, or send emails or
Yeah,
whatever, have an
totally
internal
great.
meeting.
It's like you're like microdosing stress responses, right? Like, that's
Yeah.
100%. And the same thing's happening. It doesn't. You don't have to think of it from like like cycles or week cycles or month cycles. Like you said, think about it in 4-hour increments, right? Where you're sprinting for 4 hours, and then you're allowing essentially 12 to 20-hour recovery. If that's how you want to do it, because doing lead research, like, the stuff's not stressful, at least from a fight or flight standpoint, from an autonomic standpoint, it's not stressful. So yeah, you could definitely do that, and it really works out well. And I know when I do that, like when I wake up in the morning, I do my workout, I have 20 cups of coffee, I can just sort of grind, right? And I get through it. But by the time like 12, 1 o'clock happens, you know, I'm almost like done at that point. At that point, like, I need to switch over to, maybe writing or something a little less intensive.
Yep. And now, when you were talking about, different athletes and they have to maybe change how they're working out or whatever it might be, I had this like internal kind of dilemma, or this internal thought of, again, as someone that's ambitious, I can get fired up by people that really push the limit. Like I like going on the Rock's Instagram and seeing him fly into Beijing and work out at 1 a.m. and then go to the set and do that. Or, different people, these Navy SEALs or whoever like that, that gets me fired up. But at the same time, it's like, well, I'm not them. I'm just not the Rock. I can't go on 2 hours of sleep and do all that crazy shit. And like, I'm just not at that level. So like, do you think like that hustle porn or whatever, Gary V, that type of stuff, do you think
Yeah.
that's just all bullshit, or is there some value to that? Does that like create a negative perception of what's realistic for most people?
Well, I mean, yeah, because think about it, right? That's like saying you're gonna go get on a treadmill and turn into the same bull.
Right.
Like that is like real, like from a mental standpoint, yes, we have much larger capacity to adapt and get better than something from a muscle fiber standpoint or tendon length standpoint. Like all those things matter in just being really, really fast, right? But we all still have our ranges of capacity that we can work within. Like a lot of these things are physiological, like hormone makeup, the state of your autonomic nervous system, which is like your parasympathetic, sympathetic, fight or flight, rest and digest sort of responses, right? Like, dude, if you had a really a traumatic childhood, like your bandwidth for working within stress is really low, right? And it's been proven. So there's a great study they did on Holocaust survivors. And this will sort of drive this home, that in Holocaust survivors, they looked at their great grandchildren, and they looked at their great grandchildren's ability to adapt to stress. All right. And their great grandchildren had limited capacity to adapt to stress. They lacked a specific hormone, right? They lacked a specific hormone. So when stressful activities happened, there was a heightened stress response. It was more detrimental to their system. That's all based off epigenetics, right? That's all based off the concept that because their great grandparents went through such trauma that it literally depleted hormonal resources for generations of family.
Wow.
So how the hell is Gary Vee and all these other people, right? If that's the type of shit that we're dealing with, right? So I don't want to put limitations on people because I think really anything's possible. But there's comes a point where you have to know yourself and how hard you can push. And if you can be the Rock or you can be Usain Bolt, whatever. And granted, you could work that way. You could work towards that, but understand that there's always there's a limiter to a certain extent. And that could be a daily limiter, right? It could be like, dude, I can't work 20 hours a day, like Musk, right? Like I can't do that. Right. But I can do 8. And then over time I can eventually get there. So yeah, does that answer your question?
No, it does. I found that research to be interesting because sometimes I read, a biography about someone and say they had a really rough childhood. Maybe they grew up really poor or, had whatever, battles that they had or, they overcame, dyslexia or something. And then they, became really successful. I feel like some of those people are like, man, I've been grinding since I was 5 years old. So now I can grind when I'm 25 years old. And that maybe that's like built up over time. I don't know if that's legit.
Yeah, but if you go to any like poverty driven area and any social economic area in any major city, there's going to be a lot of things that are going to completely look at the opposite of that, right?
Yeah.
Where a lot of times trauma does cause trauma, and trauma does cause a lot of bad issues, and there's a lot of things that people can work out of, man. I mean, my dad was an alcoholic. He committed suicide. Like, there's ways you can sort of work out of this, but we just have to be smart on the way that we do it. Like I posted something yesterday on LinkedIn and said the worst thing a manager can say is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Because that manager has no clue what can actually kill that person. All right. And I don't mean that like a literal term. I mean, it's just like sometimes what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Doesn't make you stronger. It actually makes you weaker. But as long as we're intelligent about it, it won't. But we have to understand the stress that we're giving people.
Yep. So, I mean, you brought up, your father, was an alcoholic, right? And I think whether people get down, a path of addiction or not, there are healthy and unhealthy ways of managing stress. So, outside of structuring my day, right? I think that's great advice, like structuring your activities to do the right way or focus on certain days or certain times a day. Like, what are other things that like what are some of the priorities that I should be having? Because I see all the, again, I see all the gurus out there saying, I wake up and I meditate for 45 minutes and then I journal and then I walk for 3 miles and then I work out and then I eat this really healthy breakfast and then I, make $1 million. And then it's like, oh,
Yeah.
this whole list of like, help me if I'm starting off at a base level. Like what should I be, how should I be incorporating maybe a few habits into my week?
Yeah. It's one of these things where all that stuff is great, and I think all that stuff you should try and see if it works within to, your model of recovery or your model of just sort of making yourself feel better. Um, it's one of these things where, like, Bo Jackson woke up and probably, and ate like McDonald's for breakfast, and there's a ton of other
Right.
athletes that do that and dominate, right? Um, so I think you just need to figure out what works best for you. So, you know, I look at, remember I was saying about like the recovery response for athletes and how some recovery modalities wrecked athletes and other recovery modalities made other athletes feel better, right? Remember
Hmm.
the cold bath and the sauna and stuff like that. It's real, right? So, me waking up at, you know, 4 a.m. and then journaling for 2 hours and then working for 3 hours or walking for 3 hours or whatever, and then making $1 million. That first 5 hours when I'm journaling and walking, I'm probably stressed out the whole time because I feel like I should be working, right?
Mm.
And maybe that causes more stress for me than just actually waking up and doing it, right? So it's easier.
Hmm.
My life is easier when I can get up, I can work for a couple hours, then I can go to the gym, then can come back work for a couple hours. Like that works for me, and that works for my personality. But it also comes down to like, we have everybody talks about mental health, right? Mental health is fantastic, but other people, way people manage their mental health is all very different, right?
Mm.
Like me doing meditation is not the greatest thing for me, right? It doesn't fit into my sort of personality. Sometimes I like to just go lift heavy ass weights,
Yeah.
right? Or sometimes I like to run. Like that helps my mental health, right?
Hmm.
So when companies buy these services and whatnot about helping their employees, most of the time none of it's really, you're not giving it's hard to help every single person in your employee with just buying headspace for every single company,
Right.
or just having a yoga at lunch once a week. So I guess to answer your question, you have to figure out what works for you. And if that is meditation, awesome. If that is journaling, awesome. If it is walking, awesome. Just keep on doing it, build it into your schedule, understand how your body's adapting to it, and then make adjustments from there.
How do you take away that guilt of not working, of spending that time? Because I have been working on, trying to put some of these habits into place and I've been doing them. And sometimes I'm good about it. And I tell myself, hey, that if you don't do this thing, if you don't get your run in this morning and you skipped it and you went to do work instead, you're going to feel terrible in the afternoon.
Mhm.
Like, get that in. It's going to help you feel better. But I just, there's always just something in the back of my head. And I think people will relate to this. It's like, you should be working right now. Or like, there's more emails you could send, or you haven't hit your quota yet, or, whatever it might be. And for me, at least, there's always that lingering in the back of my head. And I'd have to imagine as an entrepreneur, that happens to you sometimes too, where the job's never over. I mean, you could work 24 hours a day and nothing, you'd still have more to do. So how do you help manage that self-talk?
Uh, I lean into it quite honestly.
Mm,
And I'm a firm believer is that you have to earn the right to recover, right?
okay.
You don't just get to recover, right? Like like
Yep.
you do have to stress yourself out to allow that recovery to happen and to sort of super compensate, right? So I think you have to ask yourself is, do you need the recovery? All right. And is this exactly what you need right now? All right. To make yourself better. All right. And if it's not making yourself better, then keep on working or keep on pushing through or go for that run. Right. But if you know that you've earned the right to recover, then by all means, that's when you have to be honest with yourself and take that recovery.
Mm. Yeah, I guess it's just it's just trying to kind of put it into perspective. And yeah, to your point, earning it and saying, hey, I've been working like a dog for all week or all month or whatever. And it's like, or I crushed it yesterday. It's like, all right, I need to take some time this morning for myself, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. I mean, and there's going to be times where stress is necessary. Right. And like, I talk about managers and leaders being smarter about how they manage their people. And I feel I worry sometimes it comes off that I'm not saying like don't grow really fast, because I'm okay with hustling. I'm okay with working hard. I'm okay with working really fucking hard. All right. But you just have to know within yourself and within your people and within your company at what point you allow that back off to happen. Right.
Yep.
So work as hard as you possibly can to achieving your goals, because there's a mental health advantage to that, to succeeding. Right. So work as hard as you possibly can, but just once you like understand that there has to be there must be recovery built into that. All right. Because quite like, again, like think about like a professional athlete. Like, do you know what it goes through to try to win a gold medal? Like it's pain, it's suffering, it's crying. All right. But we get it to a point where like you're right there. All right. You're right at that point where we're adapting as much as we humanly possibly can. And then that's when we're backing off. Now we're using
Mm.
data and whatnot to understand that. But what happens in companies, they just don't ever back off. They
Yeah.
just keep on scaling, right? Like it's just like, let's just go. Let's just keep on going. For the next 5 years, we're going to push to $100 million, right? But
Yeah.
they don't ever understand. It's like there is a point at there's multiple points during that sprint where you have to back your team off a little bit, allow recovery to happen, and then keep on going. And that's the part that we miss. That's what salespeople miss. That's what companies miss. That's what VCs miss, is that there's ways to quantify all this and understand a better way to use people to grow companies. But we just have to take not a science first approach, but a logic based approach to all of it.
Yeah, and I mean we're talking on the first day of the month, right? Where it's like, I'm on a monthly quota, and whether I hit or not last month is irrelevant. Now that the workday starts, it's like, all right, well, what have you done for me lately? And that's just the mentality of, 99% of sales teams and sales leaders. It's like, well, we got to get to the next thing, and probably of CEOs too. And you bring up a point of, managing this into a day or a week, but even on a larger scale, I I kind of have a I have an interest in like a professional athlete's schedule, in the sense that, a football player goes out and they have training camp where they're getting ready, and then they have the season, and then they have the playoffs, and they have an off season.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And they're not just like sitting on the couch the whole off season, but it's probably a toned down, the first few weeks after, the season, they're probably doing nothing. They're probably relaxing with their families. Then they're getting back into it and, working on different skills or lifting weights or whatever it is, but they're not flying all over the country every week. They're not traveling. They don't have all these meetings. So it's kind of that time to rebuild and work on different things, and
Mm-hmm.
try to figure out what it is, what you want to do after playing sports, or what team you want to join or whatever it is, and then you get back after it, and then you have that intense season. And there's points, one day a week you might get off or something like that. But I wonder if companies ever think about that, like giving a few weeks off or a month off, or hey, this is our slow month, and hey, everyone, take that month and do whatever you want. I don't know if you've ever come across that at a
Yeah.
business.
So it's a good point. So in sport, it's usually called GPP, general physical preparedness, and
Yeah.
SPP, specific physical preparedness. And then you go into your season, right? But what happens is within season, it's highly stressed out, and actually people lose fitness sometimes, depending on the sport. But like track and field, they lose some of their fitness in season.
Mm-hmm.
Football players, they lose some of their fitness in season, like their general fitness. And that general fitness gives you the ability to build things on top of, right? It's like a pyramid. You want to have a really robust base of your pyramid where you have just general physical fitness and general mobility, flexibility, and all these things, right? And the same thing with like salespeople. It's like you want to have, but during that, we'll go back, during that GPP phase, they're stressed out, but not to a point where it's detrimental to their health, right? They're just building this baseline. Once they have that baseline, then they build on top of it. Now, with companies, can we do the same thing? It gets a little hard because it's always moving the needle forward, right? There's no off season, but there is down times. Now think about it like this, right? So I'll give you something sort of real to use. In sport, we use something called a wellness survey. All right, and that wellness survey is, like 5 questions that look at like more muscle soreness, sleep, anxiety, like 2 other things. I'll send it to you so you can post it in the show notes if you want. All right. And they use that and then they benchmark that against previous times. All right. Those scores, they do them every single day. All right. For all their athletes, and they make adjustments either on a daily basis or on a weekly basis or monthly basis based off that general survey. So think about it from a sales manager standpoint. If you do this survey at the beginning of a quarter and at the end of a quarter, what that can help you do is assess how stressful that quarter was for your people. All right. And you track it over a trend line. And what you do is you take that and you overlay that over a period of a year, 2 years. And then you can understand how stressful and how impactful is certain times of the year are to your people, right? Because that gives you real data. So think about it like this. If you know that coming into, like, let me ask you, what's the most stressful time of year for you from a growth standpoint?
Probably where we're at right now, Q4 at the end of the year.
So Q4, right? So you know coming into Q4 that your team is that's going to be it's the most important time, but it's also the most stressful time. Yeah. So in sport, I would take that and that would mean that I would deload them coming into the beginning of Q4. So I would back off for maybe a couple of weeks, right? Allow them to recover, get their mind right, like their body right, and all those other things. So I know that they are super compensating going into Q4, right? Because they have adapted. All right. And they're coming back up and now they're peaking, right? They're ready to just fucking demolish everything because their whole system has recovered and is ready to go. All right. And then I also know that coming out of Q4, that they're going to be really damn tired. All right. And that going back into the first quarter, that they might, there might be a long tail effect of that. Right. So what do? I assess my OKRs going into Q1, and I say, okay, they're coming out of the most stressful quarter. Let me take a back off week before we go into that. Adjust OKRs slightly so that the goals are maybe a little bit more manageable or whatever have you. So you get sort of that they're down. You get slightly of a recovery process, and they peaked again coming into a week after Q1 started. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And how would you advise, let's say, I take on a new team or a new job and, I'm a new manager, right? I'm not the CEO. I'm not even a VP, but I've got a team working for me. Like, how do I lead them in the right way? Like, how do I take into account all of the things that we're talking about while knowing that I'm not the main guy or, I don't have the final say. I've got people that I've got to report to and goals that they tie me to. So how can I still lead with that, empathy and lead with, keeping their best interest in mind and knowing that it's individual?
Yeah. And maybe I use sport analogies too much, but like you're from Mass, right? So if Bill Belichick gets fired tomorrow, all right, and the new coach comes in. Yeah, I know. But he definitely will not. And a new coach comes in. Do you think that coach is going to be like, all right, I'm taking over. I'm going to put everybody into the ground day one? Probably not, right? Because there's a respect earning standpoint there. Like there's a couple things, right? So what you want to try to do is you want to figure out a way to get your team back to baseline or understand where baseline's at. So use a survey or just sit down and ask questions, right? But, document that and understand is that, the majority of my team is stressed out right now. All right. So if the majority of my team is stressed out or anxiety ridden because their boss got fired or whatever have you, you need to let that dissipate just a little bit. Right, because if they're already super stressed out, so what is adding more stress going to do to it? Eventually, you're just killing yourself in the long term. All right, so back off a little bit, understand their state, and then give it a couple of days or a week or something like that, and figure out, like, again, use the survey or something like that to understand is like, did they recover a little bit? Are they feeling better? And now that they are feeling better, all right, then you can go in and they say, okay, now we're going to set KPIs, OKRs, whatever. Let's go to town. All right, and so that's what I would do because I see no other way in like history, either military or sport, where a new leader comes in and doesn't earn the respect of their people first before asking them to do, to hit goals they've never hit before.
Yep. And then I love that point. And then you would also probably have to take that to the one-on-one level where it's a continuous process, right? Because, Tom might have that bandwidth of 20 and Bryan might have that bandwidth of 12. And so if you see them both rising up, one of them might be able to go a little bit harder than the other one. And so trying to like ask those questions, like, would you recommend just being open about it and just saying, like, leading maybe with saying, hey, some like talking about your own mental health and how sometimes you get burnt out, or shit, I got to take a vacation, or I got to call it sometimes, or
Yeah.
how would you handle that?
And especially in sales, man, like you guys are athletes, all right, and to a certain extent, like you're paid to perform, all right, and just like in sport, there's going to be low performers, there's going to be middle performers, there's going to be high performers. It's impossible in this type of setting to ever set the same goal for every single person in your organization. I mean, if that's the case, then if you do want to do that, you have to be really strict in your hiring. All right. And I guess someone could say if they don't fit, they don't fit, and you just push them out the door. But that just doesn't make sense either from a business, strategy standpoint. So yeah, you're gonna have to set individual OKRs or KPIs, whatever you're using. You're gonna have to try to assess what type of individual they are, right, and how best you could use them. Yeah, but I think you have to. I think sales and business as a whole is if you truly want to prevent burnout, you truly want to prevent mental health issues, the only way to do that is on an individual basis. It's really hard to do it at scale.
Yeah. I want to pivot. I've seen you put this quote out a few times, and I'm a fan of this person as well. But I've seen you put out a Marcus Aurelius quote that people look for retreats for themselves in country, by the coast, in the hills. There's nowhere that a person can find a more peaceful and trouble-free retreat than in his own mind. So constantly give yourself this retreat and renew yourself.
Mhm.
I'm curious what that quote does for you or means to you.
I think if you look at Marcus Aurelius, right, he's probably the most stressed out individual of his time,
Yeah.
arguably. Obviously there's probably peasants that were a hell of a lot more stressed out by him, but let's use it sort of like on a global level. The only way for that guy to recover was in his own head, right? It's not like he was going to speak to a psychologist, right? And if he went to like the Senate, he'd get knifed, right? Because he was showing weakness, all right? So that was the only way for him to do that. So for him, he understood that the only way to control his thoughts and to control his ability to recover was by controlling himself to a certain extent, right? So I guess to sum it all up, the only way that you're going to find recovery is if you do it yourself. All right. And if it is in your head, if it's recovery, if it's workouts, whatever that is, you have to find whatever that is for yourself and then lean into it.
Mm. Are you a big stoicism guy? Like, do you read about that? And
I do, but I feel like I haven't read enough philosophy to like put myself into one box or the other. Like I do love it. I think Marcus Aurelius came around to me at a time I think that I really needed it. So it's a book that really helped me and sort of supported me. So, but I'm sure there's other things that are just as good as well.
you strike me as someone that's really well read, talking about just not only sports, but you talked about historical figures, people in war, talking about stoicism. Like, are there any books that have particularly impacted you, or even anything that you're interesting that you're reading now?
So two main books are Anti-Fragile by Taleb and Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by Sapolsky.
Say that one again. Why zebras don't get ulcers?
By Robert Sapolsky. He's a
Okay.
professor out of Stanford at evolutionary biology. And I think every manager should read it in the world, right? Because it's all about the stress response and what it does to human beings. Actually, that study that I quoted about the Holocaust survivors, I think it was actually in that book. There's another really cool one about the person, and I could be getting this wrong, but I'm going to say it as I think I read it, is the person who wrote like Peter Pan, right? And I probably just ruined the punchline there, but essentially there was two kids. One was loved by their mom, whatever have you. Another one was, put in a closet pretty much his whole entire life, right? Lived a horrible life, never grew, was like 16 and he was like 4'2" and like weighed like 65 pounds, whatever, just completely malnourished and whatnot. What it ends up happening, that was all because of stress, right? Like they were feeding him, but he was so unloved that's what stress did to him. All right, that's what that stress response, it prevented him from aging, from growing and whatnot. And as soon as he was put into a loving environment, he grew to be, 6 foot tall, whatever. But that person is actually the person who wrote the book Peter Pan. And if you think about it, it's like the boy who never grows old and whatnot. It's a really interesting story. But those two books for sure are probably my favorite from a stress response standpoint. Like you said, Marcus Aurelius, I really like. I'm reading a book right now called Sapiens by Sapolsky,
Mm.
which is about like the study of just evolution and whatnot. That's pretty cool. Uh, but yeah, I'm not really a fiction guy. I can't really do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. I'm gonna have to check. Antifragile's been on my has been on my list for a while, and I've never heard of the Zebra book, but I'd like to check them both out.
Definitely.
What's your take on social media, and more specifically, so obviously, there's a new documentary, The Social Dilemma, that came out a few months ago. There's a lot of talk, post-election and pre-election about, the things that, places like Facebook and Twitter and, the addictive nature of them, and, how they can sway your opinion on things. And for me, I find it to be, sometimes can be a relaxing thing to turn your mind off for 5 minutes and scroll, but other
Mhm.
times it can be really triggering, and it can, create a stress response because you see someone that, you hate on there, or someone that's, got their big ass car or whatever, and then you're getting jealous about it. Or there's all these different kind of negative connotations that can happen. But do you have a strong opinion on social media? Like, do you use it? Like, do you,
Yeah, I mean, I, again, I think it just depends. It's so individual, Like
yeah,
I try to stay away from any sort of like big statements like that because there's a lot of positive things to social media. Like I like
yeah,
LinkedIn. I like LinkedIn pisses me off sometimes, but I like it. Like I get great ideas from there. It drives my business in a lot of way, right? So I think there's a lot of education, social media. I mean, Facebook, you can see family, Twitter. I learned a ton of stuff too.
yeah,
You just have to be able to assess if you're that person that it affects, and if it does affect, then it is something you have to stay away from. Or
yeah.
if or if you do want to be on there, you just have to give yourself limiters or limitations or whatever to understand, how long you can actually be on there before it actually does hurt you.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think the way that I want to wrap this, I think, like, I'm really excited because this is a topic that I've been, I've experienced myself, mental health issues, burnt out, anxiety, the list goes on, and have sought out resources and sought out ways to kind of help with that on my own. And I love the concept of bringing the 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 data and the science from sport and from what internally, your science
Mhm.
of your biology, into how you can be a better performer. So I guess the place that I'd love to finish off is, let's just say there's someone out here that's, an AE or an SDR that's like, man, what you're saying, I am feeling, I dig it, I love it, Bryan. I'm feeling, terrible, or I can relate to this, but I got my boss, and he or she is just a hard driver, and we've got these goals, and we're going after our Series A right now, and the list goes on and on. Like, how do I take this as an AE right now into my day, into my week, knowing that there could be someone watching how many calls I make a day, there could be someone looking at my calendar, or
Mhm.
making sure that I'm setting the same amount of pipeline every single week or month. Like, how do you handle some of that interpersonal
Sure.
communication?
Yeah. I guess this is probably gonna piss a lot of people off, but like
Let's do it.
you're not governed by a contract, right? So you're not locked in anything. So in track and field, if you work with a coach who just doesn't fit into your model, meaning your physiological sort of model, then it's probably not the right coach for you. All right. So that's something you do have to assess as well. If just that's not possible, then you got to do whatever you can to be able to recover in your downtime. Like you have to try to eliminate stress. Like your body doesn't interpret stress any different, like regardless if it's at work or with your spouse or anything. Like it's all stress. Like that's the way your body perceives that threat and then adapts to it, right? So if work is so stressful, then you're going to have to eliminate stress in other places or really work hard to recover, right? And that's when like these things that we see on LinkedIn about like lifestyle management, manage your mental health, and all these other things, that's when they do come into play. Like that's when you must exercise because exercise is going to build that resiliency and those adaptive reserves. That's when your diet needs to be on point because a poor diet is going to add to stress, right? It's going to
Mm.
cause a stress response and inflammatory response in your system. That's when you do have to worry about sleep, right? Because we know sleep, especially if when you go into like sleep debt, it does change your ability from a mindset standpoint, right? You have it disrupts your ability to control like negative thoughts, right? So we know that you need to be able to do that. That is some time that maybe you do need to talk to someone. Maybe that's when you deal with Talkspace or Headspace. Maybe you get blood testing done to understand if there's anything from a malnourishment standpoint that you need to do, right? If you're low in vitamin D or vitamin C or vitamin A, like all these other things, like that's when you have to come into like, dude, I'm in the middle of a season. You know, if we're using the NFL example, I'm in the middle of the season and I need to play on Sunday. So if you need to play on Sunday, then you need to do whatever you can to be able to sort of adapt and get ready to recover or to get ready to perform. So yeah, that's really the only way to do it, man. I mean, if you're not going to leave the company, then you just need to stop complaining and manage yourself better.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I love putting the accountability on you, right? It's part of it is, if you have access to the science and things that you're doing, that's amazing. If you don't, if you're just on your own and you're an SDR and you're not, bringing on a whole platform or a whole team to a company and you're just managing yourself, like you gotta turn inward, I think, right? And understand, like, know when you're feeling stressed, like you can feel it in your body and give yourself that break, or know when you're feeling good and like really lean into that, like you're saying, and earn the recovery and really try to go and match those ebbs and flows, to give yourself the best chance so that you're still working super hard, you're still getting your shit done, you're still being a top performer, but you're not losing your sanity because of it, and not going to set yourself up for failure down the road.
Yep, totally agree, man.
Absolutely. Bryan, I appreciate this, man. What's the best place for people to find you, to connect with you, to learn more about what you've got to say? If there's people that want to bring you on board to their company and think that their people can help, or that you can help their people rather, where would you point them?
Yeah, so I'm the worst at this. I don't know my Twitter handle. I don't know my LinkedIn handle. But go to myleon.co. And what we do is we actually early predict things like employee burnout and employee mental health issues, and we actually provide the fix as well. So if you want to look at this for your company and use a sports science driven way to sort of scale your company faster and smarter, just go to myleon.co and check it out. Other than that, you can email me at brian@myleon.co.
I love it. People, by the time you're listening, it's probably 2021. Get your head right. Hit up Bryan, ask him some questions, and he's putting out really good content on LinkedIn also, that you can follow, and I suggest connecting with him. I appreciate it, Bryan.
All right, cheers. Bye.
Thank you so much for checking out that podcast. I hope you saw value, whether you're working out right now or doing the dishes or laying around the couch, whatever you're doing right now while you're listening to this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found some value. If you did, the only thing that you can do to really help me out is to share this podcast with a friend, share it on social media, and please subscribe wherever you're listening, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever it is, and leave a review on Apple if that's where you're listening. That's what helps us to spread reach, helps us to get better guests, like the one that you heard just now, and to give you as much value as possible. So connect with me, LinkedIn, Tom Alemo, Instagram, Twitter, Tommy Tahoe, and subscribe, leave a review, and make it a great day. Peace. Thank you so much.